uh, current occupant of the White House was, or just after he was elected. And I had to go back to it because but I had to reread it. You can all hear me now, right? In the past, a while back, I didn't really like to get too political in the pulpit. But the past 4 years, I've come to the realization that it's not only necessary, but a moral obligation to speak out, say things, and see as I see them. And I'm glad that our liberal religious tradition allows for freedom of the pulpit so that whoever is in our virtual pulpit can speak without fear of reprisal.
Well, I want to speak bluntly about what's happening. And some people, I don't know that anybody here will necessarily disagree, but some people who may, if they joined and have never been here before, may have. But I really believe that if your faith doesn't speak and act out when necessary, especially in politics and the fate of our nation, then your faith is kind of selfish and it's worthless. Dr. King once said, if I wish to compose or write or pray or preach well, I must be angry. Then all the blood in my veins is stirred and my understanding is sharpened. So I'm not Dr. King, but I am pretty angry. I think like most of you are in some ways. I believe that democracy, the democracy we've all lived, imperfect as it is in the United States, is very sick. And I think that over the past 4 years, it's become not only sicker, but it's on the verge of death. And I'm not only speaking about the COVID pandemic, I'm speaking about the idea of democracy. 4 years ago, I said that I didn't say that as hyperbole. And I say that again. I don't believe it's hyperbole. I don't say it as an over-the-top statement to get your attention. There were a lot of people, not in our congregation, I believe, but a lot of people, you've heard them, they say, come on, you can't believe that it's as bad as it was. It's not as that, it's not going to be the end. It's going to be okay. We don't know what's going to happen yet. That's what they were saying. Well, that's like seeing a person running blindfolded toward the edge of a cliff and not doing anything, thinking, well, we just don't know how that's going to turn out. Of course, we know how that's going to turn out. We know that if that person continues running with that blindfold on, that person is going over the edge of that cliff. And to ignore that, not to shout, stop running, take off the blindfold, to do nothing, makes us responsible for the death of that person. So over the past 4 years, we've been watching as democracy in America is not merely racing toward the edge of a cliff, but being shoved towards it by a narcissistic, petty bigot, by his cronies in Congress, and his equally bigoted crony appointees. We've watched as he's duped millions of people believing to the idea that he alone can save America, that he is the chosen one. You remember that? And it's not just the uneducated, out of work white folk in middle America or in the South who believed him. I've met a lot of highly educated people, maybe you have too, who did the same thing and who still support him. Let's not forget the way also that the media over the course of the previous election and over the course of the past 4 years have courted him and given him thousands of free hours of airtime by airing his rallies. And they've made him the darling of the news and internet because it gets ratings. That's what the media does. Just a couple of weeks ago, when Joe Biden had his town hall, one of the networks decided that they would have Donald Trump have his town hall at the exact same time. Trump is big ratings and he loves it. We've heard ad nauseum about the wall, about how much he's done for Black Americans. We've heard ridiculous amounts of time spent on Hunter Biden and about his plans to, Trump's plans to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with something that's big and beautiful. But there's no specifics. We've seen how he handles the press, especially women journalists, especially Black women journalists. Based on his choice of vice president and his appointment of people in banks and Wall Street executives as leaders of various departments, climate change deniers, racists, homophobes. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that we are headed over a cliff from which there may be no return, at least not for many years, if something doesn't change on November 3rd. And so, like Dr. King, my tendency is to go right to anger. Dr. King said there is a place for anger and ranting if it's directed into positive action. That's what he was talking about when he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail to white Jewish and Christian leaders who were saying that he was an outside agitator who would do more harm than good, and that he should stop his calls for direct action and civil disobedience. In that well-known paragraph in that letter, he wrote, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Moreover, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds." I think that's important for us to remember today. As one candidate speaks to a certain base of people, saying that everyone else is wrong and disagrees with him or un-American, anarchists, he talks about anarchist cities, and the other candidate says that he will be a candidate and a president for all people. Martin understood the deep and inescapable connection between spirituality and commitment to social justice. He understood what the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures were doing and talking about when they spoke boldly against the injustice, not only of those foreign oppressors that the Jews lived under for so long, but against the injustices and evils that were being perpetrated by the Hebrew kings and leaders who oppressed their own people. He quoted frequently from the prophet Amos, who wrote this, speaking in God's voice. He says, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs, to the melody of your harps I will not listen, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos, like the other Hebrew prophets, was speaking to a nation and its leaders in a very similar circumstance to ours. At the time Amos was speaking, Israel was actually prospering, mostly because other nations were leaving them alone. But that prosperity wasn't benefiting everyone. In fact, the rich were getting very rich off the labor of the poor, and the poor were getting poorer as the rich leaders increased taxes on them. The leaders were a bunch of self-satisfied hypocrites. They placed heavy religious burdens on the people. That cost a lot of money. Does that sound familiar? Because nationalism and white Christianity have had a long, cozy relationship in American history. But over the past century, and especially during times of war and civil unrest, we've seen the rise of a nationalist faith that is not at all different from the nationalist faith that Germany saw during the 30s. And so now we're faced with the challenge of Amos and the other prophets. We're faced with the challenge that a lot of people and religious leaders in Germany and Europe faced when the Nazis took power. I think of people like Corrie ten Boom. Maybe you know the story of Corrie ten Boom and her family, who lived in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. They were very devout members of the Dutch Reformed Church, and they had a lot of Jewish friends, and they hid Jews in the walls and the basement of their family's watch and clock repair shop. Eventually, she and her family were betrayed by a neighbor, and they were sent to concentration camps. She was the only one that survived. Or I think of the German Lutheran minister, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote, he says, "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheels itself." You ever see kids try to wreck another kid on his bicycle when they're riding? They ride a bike and they throw a stick in the spokes of the wheel, and it makes the wheel bend and go all over the place. Bonhoeffer was a key figure in what became known as the Confessing Church. There were a group of anti-Nazi dissident members and clergy in the German Protestant church that opposed Hitler and his Nazis, who wanted to take over the church. And some of the church leaders were saying, okay, we'll work with the Nazis, not Bonhoeffer and a lot of his friends. And the spoke that Bonhoeffer and his colleagues eventually came to believe that they had to drive into the wheel of the Nazi injustice was actually to try to kill Hitler. I'm not suggesting anything that drastic. But in the face of Nazi atrocities, the full scale of which Bonhoeffer learned through other dissidents, he concluded that the ultimate question for a responsible man to ask is not how is he to extricate himself from the affair, but how the coming generation shall continue to live. That's what we have to think. Not how are we going to get out of this, but what about the future generations? Bonhoeffer and all of his colleagues were arrested and they were executed, and he was only 39 years old at the time. So to those who kept asking me 4 years ago, and who still ask, do I really think that's going to happen here, something that drastic? I say, yes, it can happen here. And if you don't see it and do something about it, you're willfully blind and you're complicit in it. The meaning of the work of Dr. King and people like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Bonhoeffer and Harvey Milk and Rosa Parks, and in our own tradition, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, and so many others, the meaning of their work and their suffering and their martyrdom hangs in the balance now. Justice and compassion and peace all hang in the balance right now. The unity of the nation hangs in the balance. There's a concerted effort to undo the advance in women's rights, in LGBTQ rights, and in the rights like freedom of speech and freedom of the press. There's a concerted effort to deny people of other religious traditions, especially Muslims, of their rights. We have to remember what Dr. King said. He said we should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal because they made it legal. But it was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. So the question we have to ask ourselves today is where we stand. Are we going to stand idly by and wait and see? Or are we going to watch quietly as the already fragile social safety net that protects so many of our citizens is destroyed and unraveled? As a pandemic that could have been at least mitigated, if not prevented, from killing over 225,000 people already, continues to kill possibly hundreds of thousands more? Or as the least among us have the few protections they're afforded taken away so that those who already have more than enough can be further enriched? Because that's what's happening. You know, in 2009, the minimum wage in the United States was $7.25. In 2020, the minimum wage in the United States is $7.25. Think of that. And yet, in 2009, the 400 richest Americans in the nation were worth $1.27 trillion. And in 2020, the 400 richest Americans are worth $3.2 trillion together. During the pandemic, billionaires have increased their wealth by $845 billion. Jeff Bezos himself, his net worth for the company rose from $73.2 billion at the beginning of the pandemic to now $182 billion. That's a record 65% increase. I don't know about you, but I find that obscene. And it makes me angry. So are we going to stand by as women are forced to travel hundreds or 1,000 miles for health screenings or again into back alleys because someone is appointed to a position on the Supreme Court because Donald Trump is determined to get what his base wants and have Roe v. Wade overturned or at least challenged? Or as young people are saddled with even more college debt? You know, I could go on. And you know what we face. So the question is, what do we do? Well, we pray. That sounds odd, but we pray. Something that we in our tradition, a lot of you struggle with, the idea of praying. But consider the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. When he was asked upon his return from the 1965 Selma to Montgomery voting rights march with Dr. King, he was asked, did you find time to pray? Because he also marched on the Sabbath. And he said, I prayed with my feet. Prayer for us is different. Most of us pray in different ways, if we pray at all. But prayer, no matter how you conceive of it, is a practice. And it's never effective without action. You could pray all you want, for example, to win the lottery. I don't know if you play the lottery. I don't play the lottery, but you could pray all you want to win the lottery, but you're never going to win if you don't buy a ticket. Maybe you want a hot dog, right? You want a hot dog, and you can pray and pray and pray all you want for that hot dog. But you know what? Unless you go to the store and buy some hot dogs and throw it on the grill, you're never going to get that hot dog. It takes action. Well, the same thing with change in our nation. You can pray all you want for the nation. They hold these national prayer breakfasts every year. They hold these national days of prayer and fasting. But unless you actually get up off the sofa and go to the polls or the mailbox or to the ballot drop box now, nothing is going to change. Because this year, especially, voting is an act of prayer. I imagine that most of you here, if not all of you, have already done that. You've already prayed. You've already walked to your post office or your ballot box or driven or to your polling station maybe. But maybe your family members haven't. Maybe your neighbors or your friends haven't. And it's our job to encourage them to do that. It's our job, in fact, to speak in a prophetic voice now. Just not asking, did you vote yet? Are you going to vote? We have to encourage people strongly. We have to insist that our family members, especially, go to the polls and vote. Because the nation they profess to love, if they don't do it, may be gone. We're called, I believe, as never before, to stand up to the attacks that have been happening and that will continue to happen. Each of us is being called to serve in the best way that we know how, the cause of truth and justice. That might mean some direct action. It might mean going on a march. It might mean writing letters, whatever it means. Because if we don't do that, we may, after this election, come to realize the truth of the words of the Reverend Martin Niemöller, his familiar words. Most of you know it. He was a German minister, and he wrote this. He said, "First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." And it's very possible that it could become, then they came for the Democrats. And then they came for the LGBTQ community. And then they came for those who support Black Lives Matter. Then they came for the Unitarian Universalists and the progressive Christians and the engaged Buddhists. Then they came for those loud, nasty women, like all of you. And I'm glad you're loud, nasty women. They came for anyone, they can come for anyone who disagrees, unless we do something now. You know, I said I don't like to be political a lot in the pulpit, but it's become increasingly so that I have to be, or that other ministers have to be as well. At the beginning of our nation, if you read about the Revolutionary wartime and pre-Revolutionary wartime, when we were first having elections, it was a common thing on election day for ministers to give what they called election day sermons. In fact, it was expected. It was expected that they would call the people to do what they were asked to do, to vote their conscience. And that's all I'm asking you all to do today, if you haven't. And I'm asking you to tell your friends to do the same thing. Vote your conscience. If you haven't, tell your friends to vote their conscience, and your family. Because, as Dr. King said in conclusion, the ultimate measure of a man or a human being, let's put it that way, is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand at times of challenging controversy. These are times of challenging controversy. So may we take a stand, especially in the next few days. May it be so.